You, my friends, are just in time to Take a Shift, a revolutionary podcast hosted weekly by yours truly, Belinda and Catherine, that will literally alter the trajectory of your life.
We're on a mission to listen, ignite, and transform, challenging ourselves and you, dear listener, to journey deeper and get uncomfortable. Discover what lies beyond those layers of fear, judgment, smallness, and everything else that's been getting in your way up until now. Choose to step into new possibilities and courageously wake up to the life you know you were meant to be living.
So buckle up, Buttercup, summon your curiosity, and together, let's take a shift. Hello, dear listeners. We are so excited for this podcast and this opportunity to, first of all, be here with you. And I, of course, would not be here without my beloved soul sister, Belinda. Welcome, Belinda.
Welcome, Catherine. Hi, everybody. We are super, super excited today. And before we get started, we wanted to shout out to our team. I mean, it's unbelievable, Catherine, isn't it? Like, it's not even been 2 months.
2 months.
2 months since we started this podcast, and we had no idea where it was going to take us, but it has been a magnificent journey. It feels like so many more months, if not years, than just 2, what we've gotten to create and experience. And that this could not have happened if it wasn't thanks to a committed, lovely, loving group of people who have supported us. And we wanted to shout out to them today. Julie, who is responsible for our visuals, how we show up in the world. She created these incredible cartoon characters for us that we fell in love with.
That we love.
We absolutely love. We're memed out there with them. And Julie has created our website, and she's part of our team and really helping us represent Take a Shift podcast and us individually. And we love her and working with her. Thank you, Julie. And to Joe, who's responsible for how we sound in the world. He does all of our audio and video editing, and he's all the way on the other side of the country in New York. And though he's far, we have this really dear relationship with him, and we're thrilled to have him as part of our team. Kristen, without whom this would not have even existed. She helped not only bring the name into existence,
Yep.
take a shift. She was also really the force behind putting this into form, with her skill and her guidance and her support. Kristen, we're so thrilled to be part of the Mental Health News Radio Network and so grateful for you on our team. And most recently, the newest addition to our team is Regina, and she is responsible now for all of our social media out there. So kind of putting it all together and how it's showing up on all these different platforms. And you've just been lovely to work with, and we're super grateful. And thank you to everyone. You have anything to add, Catherine?
No, each and every one of those individuals and brilliant souls is just remarkable and has really just been divine for us and guidance and love and support. And I'm just not sure how much more we could be blessed with our team and our listeners.
So we are super excited to also give a shout out to all of you who are listening right now. We've got you know, everything you can find on the internet and statistics and things these days. And on Spreaker, we have the gift of knowing where people are listening from. And we've got a beautiful group of people on the West Coast in the U.S., in the Midwest in the U.S., and on the East Coast. So we've got nationally coverage in just this 2 months. People are listening from around the United States. And we've got some friends in Mexico, we see. We've got some friends in the United Kingdom. And just yesterday when we were looking, we've got some friends in Sweden. And Catherine and I are both world travelers. We love exploring, and we're super excited that people are joining us from all different parts of the world. And we're excited for people to be listening from other parts of the world, and eventually for us to come and visit you and do some live podcasting and speaking outside of the US. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And please spread the word. Because we're just thrilled to be participating in this experience with you all.
Exactly. It's such a blessing, to say the least.
It is. It is. So, without further ado, let's jump into today.
I feel like I should give you a drum roll.
By all means. By all means.
Oh, I would love to have the big intro. Joe, if you could put something big intro in here, like trumpets or drum roll. We have an exciting podcast for you today, and it is from our own Belinda that we're going to have some amazing insight. And Belinda, I'm just going to let you do the intro and take it away.
With pleasure. With pleasure. So, Catherine and I talked about this Huffington Post article that I published in 2016. To be specific, January 20th, 2016. If you head over to huffingtonpost.com website, you'll see that it is still there. It was probably the very first article, I want to say, aside from a chapter in a book that I had written a few years prior. It was the first time that I was published, certainly in anything as recognized as the Huffington Post. And today, the plan is to read the article to you, dear listeners. I sort of think about it as story time today. I know that as I was thinking about preparing for this podcast, I was thinking, I have read the article many times, and I enjoy it and learn something every time I read it. But in preparation for today, I was thinking how much I like being read to. And I thought, we read so much online, on our phones, maybe even in books today. How often do we get read to? So I'm going to read the article, and it brought up a lot for me in preparing for the call. And I think it will perhaps bring out a lot for you. And Catherine and I will explore it after I complete reading. How's that sound, Catherine?
Sounds wonderful. And we'll put the link in our podcast as well to the Huffington Post and on our YouTube channel.
Super. So the title of the article is The End of a Misguided Love Affair. So here we go. I was 30 in Cancun with my first husband, and I felt alive and free. We were in a cafe, and the smell of coffee and sweetness was too hard to resist. It had rarely occurred to me to order coffee in my 20s, something I associated with adulthood, and therefore I did not drink. Suddenly, I felt grown up. I ordered one. My first cup of coffee. Mind you, it wasn't just any cup of coffee. Café con leche would be my first cup, more like ice cream or coffee cake. The warmth, the sweetness, the smell, childhood memories flooding my mind, and the vapors wafting in the air, entering and filling my body. I was enthralled, and I was hooked. Back home in New York, coffee began to appear up to 3 times in my daily routine. The wonderfully free stuff at the office, Starbucks before or after work, maybe after lunch if I had stepped out. I never went crazy. 3 was my daily limit at the time. But the more I drank, the more coffee became my morning companion and my afternoon rescuer. Feeling tired? I turned to coffee. Feeling festive? A cappuccino after dinner. Feeling blue about the start of my day? Coffee was there for me. We were partnered in this frenetic dance together for 15 years. During those years, I was twice married and divorced. I never cheated and I never lied, in the traditional sense. But I definitely was not completely available or honest to my partners or myself. To coffee, however, I remained loyal. Ours was a consistent, comforting, and predictable relationship. I was enamored with coffee, though I would never have admitted it at the time. Most days, I turned to my coffee more frequently than to the men with whom I shared my life. If given the choice to linger in bed with my lover or rise to my extra hot latte, well, you can guess the answer. I often reprimanded myself for the space coffee took in my life, knowing it couldn't be good for me physically, but unable to sever the emotional and mental ties that bound us. I never smoked and rarely drank alcohol, but I can recall the cigarettes my mother would hold so elegantly between extended fingers, and I imagined she felt similarly. Coffee had become part of my persona, like cigarettes were part of hers. I recall my father's daily intake of coffee. His choice was espresso. He drank it upon waking and throughout his workday. During the work week, he ate only once a day at home after 12 hours at his medical practice, rejoined by his family. Coffee was his daily sustenance, intermingled with cigarettes. And over the years, as I pondered my relationship with my parents and with coffee, my parents, coffee, my parents, it occurred to me that there may be a connection. My relationships with my mother and father, defined by a lifelong struggle to experience validation in their eyes and receive my idea of their unconditional love. And I thought about my relationship with coffee, and something clicked. Metaphorically speaking, the coffee represented my father and the milk my mother. And this strange sentence, the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Coffee had become a placeholder in the empty space in my gut and heart that still longed for the love and validation from my parents and thought this to be an adequate substitute. And with the death of my mother in 2014, this inquiry started to shed light on how my relationship with coffee, among other habits and learned behaviors, was masking a deeper truth and unsuccessfully meeting my most basic fundamental human need, love. I've made an ongoing practice of personal growth and know some things about psychology, so I wasn't surprised when I made the connection. Coffee had become mother-father love. And as I consumed my coffee and my daily intakes of mother-father love, I began to recognize that which I desired, the unconditional love available to us all in relationships, our parents being only the original relationships in our lives. The unconditional love was kept at bay as I sought the love in a substance that could never feel that empty gut and heart space. And I recognized several ways that I was avoiding my best life by continuing my love affair with coffee. Number one, distancing. At times, when meeting friends or colleagues at the coffee shop, I would find myself paying more attention to my latte than the conversation. And I've already mentioned how it came between me and my partners. Number two, judging. I couldn't understand people around me who could take it or leave it. I even judged people who didn't drink the stuff, all the while judging myself for drinking it, and worse, for needing it. Number three, resenting. When I didn't have time to stop for coffee between dropping off the kids at school and meeting my first clients of the day, I found myself feeling very angry and resentful. My need wasn't being met. Number four, numbing. I realized that coffee numbed me, and I wondered what I might be missing in these awake comas. Number five, physical incapacity. I noticed how my throat hurt and how my singing voice was affected, and how reflux had become an issue. And as singing and speaking are central to my work and pleasure, I became afraid. Number six, potential health issues. After my mother's death, I knew I needed to start becoming more accountable for my own health. Blood tests revealed that my adrenal system was in bad shape, affected at least in part by my large consumption of caffeine. And if I didn't make some life changes, ... And as I connected the dots, childhood loss and longing, desperately seeking a substitute, ignoring the real issues, sabotaging real growth. And I honestly faced my complex relationship with coffee. I recognized that our relationship must come to an end. And so it did. As I come back to myself, I am called to practice regular self forgiveness for the poor choices I've made, and I am grateful for the gifts my relationship with coffee has given me: the gift of awareness, the gift of learning, and the gift of clarity. And with this awareness and the practice of releasing this habit that has, up until 2 months ago in 2014, inhibited my ability to give and receive love, I know the next release will be easier. And I know there is much, much more to release. Here's to a new year, not of half-hearted resolutions, but to a year experiencing all the ways that life and our habits and our addictions offers us doorways to healing. So, with that, so much material, so good. My gosh, yeah, 4 years later, it's just a little over 4 years later, how for me, as I reread that article in recent weeks again this morning, how powerful the message was really for me to tell myself. And one of the things I wanted to point out today for myself was that the act of writing over the last 10 years has been really key to my own journey. The act of publishing what I've written has played a really interesting additional part, I think, in the depth of that learning. When we share the things that we're learning about ourselves, it's like we bring our own learning to another level. Do you find that, Catherine?
Absolutely. Like, because I think it's in the writing, it's reflected in our own writing, it's reflected back to us as we read and reread and remember how we felt when we wrote it and what it brings up for us in the moment that we read it. No matter how old it is, it's still a part of us. And then as it's published, as we're talking about this article, and what was that, 2012,
16.
16, as that was published, then now 4 years later, it still reminds and makes you remember why you wrote it, the impetus of why you were in the midst of writing this. And I think we always write to heal, at least a big part of that, and write to understand something perhaps we understand and can clearly state, and then what we don't understand, in hopes that through the writing we can understand it a little more clearly or somewhat with clarity. And I love that this whole article was about release, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's about observation too. And that's one thing I wanted to ask you, that, and I don't think I've ever asked you this on this article, but what was your awakening moment with this coffee relation? Because I know how much you have loved coffee. And so what was when you woke up to this way of being with coffee, and how it's a metaphor for other loss and longing. I love how you said that, childhood loss and longing. Of course, that resonates completely with me on so many levels. But when you woke up to that, how did you come about creating this metaphor, and how did it, I want to know how it felt too when you woke up to it, mm-hmm. before you even got it on paper.
It's interesting because, as with all of the writing that I do, I never have had like an intention like that I imagine that writers and authors who do it for a living have when they sit down to write an article, or they sit down to write, a chapter in their book. I'm a fairly new author, but my book and this article as well really didn't come even from an intention to write a book per se. It was writing for a long time, and then one day thinking, oh gosh, something that I've written here seems to really click, and therefore I'm going to put it out into the world and see if it's going to really click for other people. So I actually don't remember like a pivotal moment about this article. All I do remember is this was toward the end of completing my master's and that we did together, Catherine, in spiritual psychology. And during that time, I know that I had given up coffee a number of times, specifically for those health reasons. And what would always happen, like I could give it up for a certain period of time, but what I noticed why I wasn't giving it up altogether was because there would come a day where I would get triggered somehow emotionally. I'd be rushing, or as I said in the article, like this feeling of I've dropped the kids off, I'm going to meet my client, like where do I get what I need in between here? And coffee was that thing. Like literally, it was an emotional thing, it was a mental thing, it was a physical thing. And so I would be okay. I think what I would do is I didn't recognize the unmet need that was happening by not having the coffee. Somehow I could get away with it for a few days, a few weeks, even a month or two at a time. But then there would come that day where it was like, I need that love. I need that comfort. There was some emotional need really that I needed. And when that came up for me, because I didn't have the awareness of it, then I would go back to coffee. So I think when this article was getting written, it was starting to click to me because I was trying to understand, why can't I simply let go of this? Like, why does this now feel like I'm a drug addict, like that I have an addiction to this? Why? Like, what's happening there? And I started making the connections, and then it was like, oh, that's why.
The doors opened up and flooded you with this kind of insight and
That's it.
connection. Yeah.
Yeah. And often, I mean, for anything that I have published up until now, I'll start doing some writing and then I'll come back to it, then I'll come back to it, then I'll come back to it. So this wasn't something that got written in one sitting. It was, I was doing some writing, and then I don't know how many weeks or months before getting it published in the Huffington Post, I had started it and then come back to it many times. And each time I came back to it, it was like the words on the page offered me a little bit more insight upon which to develop a little bit more insight. So interacting with the things that I had been writing over weeks, if not months, then allowed me to sit with it and say, oh, I had that thought. And now on top of that thought, I'm having this other thought, and then adding to it, which then culminated in this awareness around this particular challenge.
And I love how you said I was an adult, like you were in the first marriage and you said, I'm an adult now. I've gotten the coffee, right? Like you equated that with being the adult. And yet it was all about the addiction, the search, the seek. You come back to childhood loss and longing.
Mm.
And I think that's what happens to a lot of us is that, you know, I know for me, I'll speak for me, like, let's say 5 years ago, you could have been having a conversation in person with me and really ping something that caused a lot of emotionality and a big emotional response for me. And although you several years ago, because I'm 54 now, you would have been looking at a 50-year-old woman, I was really reverting back with that emotional response as a 12-year-old little girl, right? Because that hadn't been healed, or
Mm.
that had, right? Like, so even though we're adults, when you're in the midst of emotionality or in conflict with someone or with yourself, where you don't know understand why you're reactive so emotionally or angry or whatever that is, it really does, as we know from a spiritual level, go exactly back to childhood loss and longing. I mean, that could be an entire book podcast series, Gone with the Wind series on its own, right? Because there's where the healing goes back to.
Well, and if I'm, if I'm going to be super honest and super vulnerable in this call, it wasn't as if, my dad died when I was 22. At the age of 30, my mom was still alive, but she lived in another country. And it's not like that loss and longing had taken a pause. It just was being compensated in other ways.
Mm.
I was a big diet soda drinker for all of my 20s, well, even my teens and into my 20s. And if I had written this article about my diet soda addiction, it probably would have been the same thing. The milk from my mother's breasts that I thought about with this metaphor, and the coffee, the smell, and the practice that my father would make the espresso coffee every single morning. And so the whole house would smell. What's interesting about the coffee with my dad is he always left the house before us, oftentimes before we were even awake. So I would never see him. We'd never have interaction during the week with him. And there would be the coffee. Like you would know he was there. You would know his presence was there. That feels so, that feeling that just comes up as I even think about that, right?
The smell of coffee, meaning dad.
Just the smell, like coming into the kitchen to prepare our lunch or get something for breakfast before heading to school. It was like, and on one hand, like I could smell espresso coffee anywhere in the world today and think of him, and that would bring me joy, and I feel a lot of love, and yet at the same time sadness and pain at the same time, because it also represented the absence of my dad. That the coffee itself, just that smell, replaced what I would have much rather had, which be his presence. But because he wasn't, he was working, he was a doctor, and he had a commitment outside of our family for our family, right?
Right.
It just is what it is. It is what it was. But to think about it a little bit further, it didn't deny the fact that there was an unmet need back then. And to this day, that unmet need, or that need, is one that still needs to be met. I think one of the things, as I was thinking about this morning, was, when we have people that we're struggling with in our lives, and mother, father is, probably at the top of most people's lists if we think about challenging issues we have in relationship. For those of us who have lost our parents, it's quite apparent that we're not going to get a need met from parents who are no longer on the planet, which makes things very clear, right? Like if you want somebody whispering like how amazing you are as the mother or the father, and they're physically not here on the planet, we're not going to get the need met. That doesn't mean, however, the need can't be met by someone else or in some other way. And I think that why I called this article "The End of a Misguided Love Affair," it was because the coffee and the milk are represented in here, but the diet soda was also a representation of that. The kinds of relationships that I had gotten into and the dynamics that I was playing out over and over again were also symbolic of me as a human being, not just the daughter of my parents, but as a human being having certain needs that I did not know how to meet. So I was compensating for those needs in these variety of ways. And what this article is really about is getting honest with ourselves about having needs, having it be okay that we have those needs, but starting to detach from the idea that those needs need to be met by a specific person, aka mom, aka dad, aka partner or spouse, or child. Starting to create a little bit of spaciousness, it's one of my favorite words, spaciousness around owning, accepting, and appreciating that we all have needs, and that we need to start considering how to get those needs met in ways that are not only healthy for us physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, but also healthy for our relationships, because this idea of expectation, this idea of, judging who's meeting those needs, who's not meeting those needs, etc., that is creating a lot of conflict in relationship on the planet today, and it's creating a lot of dissatisfying relationships, and a lot of frustration and aggravation. So
And an immense amount of suffering.
that's right.
Ongoing suffering, and we would also, I remember one weekend at USM, I remember, Ron and Mary always sitting there together, and their journey has been one completely together. And I remember, there's is an amazing love affair, I would assume. And, but I remember saying, Mary can't make me happy. Only Mary can join me in my happiness and enjoy that happiness together with me. But she can't make me happy. And he was like, and I can't make, the same with me, same with Mary, Ron, with you. You are the one that can make you happy, not and find that happiness. And in that suffering, from those wounds. And we search for people to take the heat of that, take the brunt of it, to take responsibility for it sometimes, when we don't want to take that responsibility for ourselves. Like, it's so much easier to put it on someone else, our partners, those that we marry, mother, father, spouse, work, whatever it is. It's so much easier to find an external place to accuse and lay the blame of our unhappiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And only it's an inside job. It's an inside job. It's not a cup of coffee in your hand. It's not, for and for those of us that have, a parent that's alive, that, we still have love and longing for, it's still not saying, oh, you did a good job, whatever. I mean, it comes from within, and we know that. So I think that's part of the waking up, right? Like, in the sense of the waking up, and then we see how we've attached and connected whatever it is we've attached and connected. You may wake up and see the person you're sleeping with, but beside you in bed, and be like, I don't know who that person is, because I've woken up to myself, and what was I thinking? Like, because you immediately become different, even when you ask the question, right? Like, when you say, why? When you ask yourself why, I mean, that could be the scariest question we ask ourselves. Why am I whatever?
Mm-hmm.
In the waking up process. And then to see what we've attached to it is even sometimes more scary, because then we have to, like, get clear on it, and then perhaps we have to unattach a lot of things that, while we were longing or while we were seeking, that we attached, that is not for our highest good.
Mm-hmm.
Like the cup of coffee. Like, when you've tried, you said you could go for weeks or months without it, and then it was just too much.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think why reading this article to myself and then out loud and talking about it with you prior to this podcast was so meaningful for me, is just to remind myself that we're on a journey. Like, this is a journey. And as you say, I love that phrase, it's an inside job. Like, this was very much about, there was a lot of pain actually in the article. It was, I mean, I remember now, even as I think back to it, I did a lot of crying when I was writing this, and there were parts of it that got edited out. Obviously, in the writing process, there's always editing.
Right.
But I really had to sit with a lot of sadness and some of that suffering, as you said, because even in the writing of it, I didn't want to admit that I still had that longing. Like, that was part of it, was like, really? I mean, how old was I 4 years ago? 46 years old? Really? At 46, I'm still longing for that. And I'm still finding ways to compensate for this mother father love that at the time, I mean, both my parents were gone. It's like, I'm never going to get that. Like, stop it. Stop longing for it, you know? But I think that part of the learning for me is that it is a journey, and recognizing the big leap that I was ready to take at that time was one, to acknowledge that need again, that need doesn't go away. When we call it maybe mother, father, love, need, but as I'm learning more about feelings and needs, and there's a whole vocabulary out there now that I've been discovering recently, it's not specific, as you said, to the mother or the father in that moment. That's part of the learning and the evolving. Is when we were children, there were things that only mother or father or the people caretaking us could provide us with at the time. But then the whole point of individuating from the parent, of becoming an independent adult, is to start navigating the world and figuring out how to get your needs met. And again, in a healthy, conscious, intentional way. And it's so simple, and yet it's so complicated. And I think a big part of it is because we've attached so with super glue, right? How and by whom those needs are supposed to be met. And this is the suffering. Like, this is the suffering. And I think I just love talking about this today, because I can even see today how easy it is to fall into that, fall into that way of thinking with my husband or with my children or with colleagues or friends or some extended family members, right? They should have done this, or they could have done that, and the gift is in being able to jump back rather quickly at this stage in my life and be able to say, wait a minute, let me, recognize what it is that I'm longing from that person and get really clear about what the need is, but then stepping away and saying, wait a minute, if that person can't meet that need, let me go get that met elsewhere. And kind of just being in this dance with, how am I taking care of myself? How am I being responsible for my experience? And as you were saying earlier, Catherine, not making other people responsible for how I feel or what I'm getting or what I'm not getting.
Yeah, and I think that is a brilliant way to look at that. And for a lot of people that I have conversation with, or clients that, and I know you and I have talked about this, you know, when you see a client waking up that you're working with, right? Like, and it's almost bewildering in the process as you watch them come alive or come back awake into who they really are on this planet, right? And in the sense, then there's a shitload of work to do in the process of waking up and then viewing the landscape of your life and what you've been doing while you're asleep, right? Like, because there's a whole lot of stuff we usually end up doing while we're asleep and making commitments under anesthesia almost, right? Like, because we're just anesthetized to our feelings, and we're anesthetized to, we've built these walls, we've protected ourselves, and we're operating in an unauthentic space that we think is us. And that's where, if you had the dry erase board and you could see all the connections, you would be drawing a cup of coffee here, and then maybe a husband here, and then maybe a friend, that's whatever it is. Like, maybe it's you're addicted to exercise, whatever that thing or event or circumstance or person is. And then somehow you have to really, like, take it apart. Like, you've got to unpack this, right? Like I heard at one point, even the alcoholic, when they quit drinking, they have to meet the personality that made them start drinking. Like, you've always got to meet yourself, because you're the only one responsible for all this greatness and all this shit and all of it, the wholeness of it, the everything about you and everything in your life you have attracted to you by saying yes to,
Mm.
right? If it's there, you've attracted it. You have pulled it in for your greater learning.
Mm.
Whether you view it as, if you're going to view good and bad, whatever that is, but something's there to mirror back that something, that a longing, a need that is or isn't being met. Something is mirroring that back to you. And I think that's a really important message. Maybe somebody that's just, maybe a listener that's just waking up, to really take that first step, in the sense of, kind of, that's what I was getting to, asking you where you were when you woke up and started asking why.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And like, even today, that the smell of that espresso takes you right back to being that little girl coming in the kitchen with the absence of her father, who's out providing for the family, but yet still absent, and longing to have more than that smell.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying again about the journey and about where we are, noticing where we are in the journey, and that there is, I hate using the word work because people don't like the idea that they have to do this personal work. Some people, I know in my relationships, the minute I say, it takes some work to be in a relationship, even people who are paying me to do this relationship kind of work, the minute I say work, it's like, don't tell me it's work. It's supposed to be easy. Like, and if it's work, then you're not supposed to be in the relationship. It's like, I think part of the work is reframing how we are judging, right? We talked about judgment and several podcasts ago, moving from so much judgment and compartmentalization in our lives to, again, this kind of embracing and noticing. As I said, like, every time I've read this article, I'm noticing something else. I'm learning something else. I'm seeing something else. I'm open to something else. And that's because I'm in this constant process, certainly in the last 20 or so years of my life, of allowing for these layers to come forward. Even as I read this article now, I'm thinking, well, what parts am I really aligned with today, and am I living, and what parts am I still working on, even though I wrote this 4 years ago, right, and made this declaration and had this clarity, because it's my journey. Some people may have been able to have that kind of awareness and just snap their fingers and boom, like something shifts permanently for the rest of their lives. I have had a few kind of experiences like that in my life, but for the most part, I will have awarenesses and then I play with them, and then I'll kind of go to sleep, and then I'll wake up again and have awarenesses and play with them. And it usually takes me a number of times to wake up to something, fall asleep to it again, wake up again. That's been my journey. And I'm sure there's 1,000 or 1,000,000 or maybe millions and millions of iterations of how people are going to experience their own journey. That said, the key to me is being able to embrace and love that journey in the valleys and in the peaks, and know that it's very personal, it's very individual. The important thing is to keep walking on that journey, right? To keep taking steps forward and doing that noticing and doing that reflecting and taking the time to consider the experiences that we've had. That is really the key, I think, to, let's say, how quickly we advance on that journey. Does that make sense?
Of course. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to say, from my perspective and what I've seen with a lot of friends and clients and people that I work with, it's a fucking job. It's a fucking job. And in my life, it still is a job, right? Because your awareness, waking up, awareness, going back to sleep, amnesia, waking back up, awareness, amnesia, slumber, however you want to say that. It is an ongoing process. And I think that is exactly the job of the soul, having this human experience. Because if there's one thing I believe, it is that soul comes into this existence, into your experience, in as your humanness, for expansion, right? That is something I believe wholeheartedly, that we are here as a soul for expansion. And as human beings on this planet, in the sense of there are definitely human beings here that are not seeking expansion. I get it. They're not listening to this podcast. I can assure you of that. If they dropped off a long time ago and went to other podcasts, because that is exactly, because like attracts like, correct? I mean, that we know of, like we have these people that come into our life and that have been sent to us to mirror back certain things that they're so easy to be around, and they validate us and they uplift us and support us. And then there are those people, whether they be family, friends, relatives, acquaintances, or someone you just meet in the grocery store, that we just resist in the moment, right? In the very moment. But and just going back to the slumber, awareness, sleepfulness, whatever it is, it's a job. Like, it's just a job. I don't think we are to sugarcoat it for anybody. I'll tell you, from my perspective, it's a job, and it always has been a job, and it always probably will be a job. And just hearing you read this article again, and I've heard it several times, I've read it several times, and yet it's still, for me as listener and reader, it still brings up those, like, the loss and longing, like childhood, adulthood, right? Like, it's all loss and longing, because that is the human part of us.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just, and the bottom line to this entire thing for me was the beauty of release.
Mm.
Right? Like, it was just, I don't know. It was just, that was so prevalent to me when you were reading it. And at the end, where I was just like, release. It sounds so easy. And it's sometimes the toughest thing we will ever do. I mean, recognizing it and becoming awake to it is tough.
Yeah.
Can be tough. And then you have to deal with it and recognize what it will or will not be in your life. And then you've got to release those things that are not for your greatest and highest good. And whether they're habits or people or events, or to say no when you think you should say yes, or to say yes when you think you should say no. I mean, that just has to be, right? I mean, it's about release and releasing.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I completely agree. And I think as we're going to be bringing this one to a close, I think it's a beautiful note to end with, this idea that, another way we've brought it up, I think, in previous podcasts has been around detachment and non-judgment, which are forms of release, I think. And recognizing that a lot of our suffering and struggling is because we continue to persist in our idea that it has to look a certain way or has to be a certain way. I mean, there was no greater lesson in my life, not only losing two parents at both of them fairly young ages, but also getting divorced twice. I mean, my gosh, I don't care if you live in the US or you live anywhere in the world. I have yet, through travels to over 50 countries, be amongst a people who said, oh yeah, we get divorced every 5 years. Like, it's cool. Like, get married, you know what I mean? Like, there's no place out there that's saying. So for any of us who have been divorced once, it's hard enough, let alone twice, right? And I know people 3, 4, 5 times who have been married and divorced. Talk about release and letting go and working with material, that I had a lot of judgment on myself and others, and to be able to, it's been probably one of my greatest achievements that I feel personally, is to be able to walk in the world with non-judgment around my relationships, and not even just non-judgment, a lot of love and appreciation and gratitude around that. So the practice of release of all the judgments and all the expectations of how I thought my life was supposed to be, being the relationship person I am, and putting so much of my effort and attention into that, And recognizing that I thought at some point, certainly in my 20s and then again in my 30s, it was supposed to look a certain way. Finally, in my 40s, I would recognize, you know what? We don't know how it's supposed to look. We're making it up as we go, right? We're making it up as we go. And the gift is to embrace it all, right? To release those judgments, release the attachments, release the people we think are supposed to do the things that we think they're supposed to do, and taking steps towards those things that we want, the things that we love, higher consciousness, more inquiry, more curiosity, and then rejoicing in what shows up along the way. And if we keep on that path, I think we won't only experience beautiful things, we'll also experience difficult things. But the way that we'll arrive at those experiences, the way that we'll walk through them, and the people will be at the end of those will be quite different than the person, the child or the young adult, the teenager that we were, who was so attached and in so much suffering and so much judgment that experience could only look a certain way from that perspective. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Beautiful way to put that. I think that's a beautiful way to end this beautiful podcast. And congratulations again on this beautiful article and bringing that forward. And thank you for reading it to us all and sharing and being very vulnerable in your sharing and the journey about this. So I appreciate it. And I know that our listeners do. And if you want to find more about Take a Shift and your own shift, you can find us at www.takeashiftnow.com. And we're on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And we have an after show video that we always put on YouTube that will go up on Thursdays, every Thursday at 9 a.m. across the world now. Mm-hmm. And we'll also link Belinda's article at the Huffington Post on all of those sites as well for you to find that easily. And Belinda, I love you.
Love you.
To God and back. And thank you again to our team that are just divine and amazing souls on this planet that we're so lucky to get to play with and work with. And until next time, dear listeners, we love you and we are so appreciative of you. And just remember, take a shift.
Until then. Thank you for listening to this episode of Take a Shift, a part of Mental Health News Radio Network. We are so grateful for your time and presence. Always remember, you're just one shift away from a better feeling day in your life. Until next time, remember to listen, ignite, and transform. Much love from us to you.